Next speaker is our keynote speaker. His name is Paul Tranter. Paul is an associate professor in geography at the Canberra campus of the University of New South Wales at ADFA. His research and teaching interests are in the areas of transport, geography, and global change. His research has made a pioneering contribution to the academic literature in the areas of child-friendly environments, active transport, and health and sustainable cities. He has also forged new areas of research by combining previously unlinked research topics, such as children's rights and peak oil, or by applying innovative concepts to urban transport. An important theme along his research is how child-friendly environments can make cities more resilient in the face of challenges such as energy stress, as examined in a book he recently co-authored with Claire Freeman, entitled Children and Their Urban Environment: Changing Worlds. You probably noticed on your way in the photographs on the wall near the registration desk, and those photos are from that book. For those of you here in the studio, today, after the symposium, Paul will be giving another talk at 4 p.m. at the Adams Building, room 33. And the title of that talk is Peak Oil and Children's Rights, a Monster's Problem or Child's Play. Please give a very warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Dr. Paul Tranter.
Well, thank you very much, Amy. I'm delighted to be here with you today. And thank you very much, Henk, for setting the groundwork with a holistic explanation, which I was starting to wonder would leave me anything to say. But you have left me something to say, so thank you very much. I'd say that a lot of the people listening and here today will be able to relate personally as well as professionally to some of the ideas I'm about to present. Either because you've got a fascination with speed, or perhaps more likely because you've experienced considerable time pressure in recent weeks. The sense that you've had to hurry, to rush, that you've never had enough time to do the things that you want to do. So what we'll do is we'll look at the complex links between speed and time pressure and health. Then we'll resolve the urban speed paradox, the paradox that speed doesn't save you time. And then we'll look at youth perspectives on some issues related to the speed paradox. To start with, we'll look at what we already know about the relationship between speed and health, our existing understandings. The obvious one is the link between speed and road safety. We know that's not a good mix. So after this symposium, if you're planning on getting run over by a car, try and pick one that's going less than 30 kilometres an hour, because you'll have a good chance of surviving. But if you get hit by something that's going faster than 60 kilometres an hour, there's very little chance you'll survive. Another thing we know about the link between speed and health is its impact on obesity. Now, part of the paradox is that the faster we travel, the more time we spend in our cars. And the more time we spend in our cars, the fatter we get. Research by Larry Frank from the University of British Columbia showed that for every extra hour per day you spend in your car, that increases the chance of becoming obese by 6%. Then there's speed and pollution. As a general rule, the faster we travel, the higher levels of pollution. That's air pollution, noise pollution, and as we'll find out later, space pollution. And then there's speed and social interaction. If you live in a neighbourhood where there's high volumes and high-speed traffic, then there's very little interaction between people in that neighbourhood. And that's a very important negative health impact, because social connection is a critically important part of people's health. But there might be a more subtle and more pervasive link between speed and health. And that could be the link between speed and time pressure. Could it be that we are experiencing time pressure because of speed? Another way of looking at this is to understand the hurry virus that Carl Honore explains in his book In Praise of Slow. It's a wonderful book. It's got some great chapters in it. It's got slow food, slow cities, slow sex, and then a chapter on children, raising an unhurried child. And in that chapter, here's one of my favourite quotes from the book. Children are not born obsessed with speed and productivity. We make them that way. And I felt really guilty when I read this book, when I read that the most common phrase that Carl Honore had used when he was bringing up his own 2 children was, and you can probably guess, hurry up. Come on, hurry up, get in the car, we've got to go, we're going to be late. So Carl and Oro were saying we need to give children time for unstructured play. But it's not just children who experience this hurry virus. Time pressure is a significant health problem for adults as well. Adults who have time pressure have stress and depression. They're also less likely to get exercise and they're more likely to eat unhealthy food. So people who experience high levels of time pressure eat fast food to save time, but they still haven't got enough time for regular exercise. There's a book called The 7 Deadly Sins of Obesity, and time pressure is listed as the second of these, right behind consumption obsession. So we know time pressure is a significant health issue. The paradox, though, is could our reliance on supposedly fast modes of transport, like cars, be linked to a lack of time or increased time pressure? Another way to look at this is, could slowing down our lives save us time? Could just moving into the sort of the slow cities, slow food, maybe the slow sex, would that actually save us time? And more relevant to this symposium, could cycling, instead of driving, reduce time pressure? This is a photo taken in Vancouver, and you can see those couple of cyclists there at the traffic lights, and one of them's looking over towards the people in the Porsche and thinking, those poor people, they must be so time pressured. And of course, when the lights turn green, the bicycles show the superiority of the cycling in terms of speed and leave the Porsche for dead. But how could cycling in any city of the world be more effective in terms of reducing time pressure than cars? Well, to understand that, we need to understand the speed paradox, and we need to understand how fast we're really going in our cars, and to do that, we need to understand the concept of effective speed. This takes a little bit of explaining, so to help you get your head around it, could I ask you to imagine yourself in a particular situation? For some of you, it may not be too hard to imagine yourself in this situation. You've got a hectic life. Your time management is all out of control. You've got to get up in the morning, you've got to get the kids out of bed, you've got to get the kids ready for school, you've got to drive the kids to school, you've got to drive the mother-in-law to the dentist, you've got to drive to work, you've got to drive home and do some shopping on the way home and pick up the children from after-school care. You've got to drive Mary to ballet and Johnny to soccer. You've got to drive to the gym. And finally, you drive to yoga. The trouble is, you can never get things done fast enough and you can never get to places quickly enough. So you decide that the solution to this is to buy yourself a new car. You think that'll solve your problems. You don't want any new car, you want the fastest new car that you can get. Now, you might be thinking, what is the fastest new car? Well, I can tell you exactly what the fastest new car is in Australia and New Zealand. And according to research by motoring organisations, this is it. The Suzuki Alto. That is the fastest new car in Australia and in New Zealand. It's a small car. It's got a 1 litre 3-cylinder engine in it. And it's the fastest new car in Australia. And you'll understand why in a little while. It may not be the fastest vehicle, though. Maybe this is the fastest vehicle. In fact, just to give you a preview, it is. So, are we fooling ourselves about saving time with machines? We think cars are saving us all this time, but do machines and cars save us time? Well, I'll tell you a little story about the machine that saves you time. And could I ask you to imagine that you live in a village, it's 200 years before the present, and it's your job every day to walk to a river and get a bucket of water. And that takes you an hour every day. But you're a genius, so you devise this machine that has all these cables and pulleys and levers and springs, and all you need to do to get your bucket of water is to pull a lever, and the machine takes the bucket down to the river and brings it back full of water. So you've saved yourself an hour. But there's a catch. And the catch is that to get the machine to work, you've got to spend an hour each day winding up the spring. So the obvious question you need to ask yourself is, should we consider that time spent winding up the spring in order to determine whether that machine is worth having? Yeah, the answer is clearly yes. You may still want to have the machine for other reasons, but it's clearly not saving you time. Now, in our society, we don't spend a lot of time winding up springs, but the equivalent of winding up those springs is the time we spend at work to earn the money to pay for the car, to pay for the fuel, to pay for the gasoline, and so on. And that is what effective speed is all about. The average speed of a vehicle after the hidden time costs are taken into account. If you want a formula to calculate effective speed, it's exactly the same formula. Speed equals distance divided by time. Distance is the same that you'd use in any calculation of speed. However, the time is not just the time you spend travelling, it's the total time devoted to any mode of transport. And for car drivers, a really important component of that is the time spent earning the money to pay for all the transport costs. This is not a new idea. Henry David Thoreau, in his book Walden in 1854, was the first to discuss the ideas behind effective speed. He and his friend were going to Fitchburg, a nearby town, and Thoreau said to his friend, "I'm going to walk and I'll get there before nightfall. You'll go by train, but you'll have to spend the best part of the day earning the money to pay for your train fare. And if I was to travel around the world, I'll always be ahead of you." So for Thoreau, in slightly sexist language in 1854, he argued that the swiftest traveller is he that goes afoot. Then in the 1970s, Ivan Illich wrote a book called Energy and Equity, where he brought Thoreau's ideas into 20th century United States. And again, in a rather sexist fashion, he explained that the typical American male devotes more than 1,600 hours a year to his car. So he sits in it while it's driving, he sits in it while it's idling, he has to go searching for the car when he's parked it, he's got to earn the money to pay for the fuel, the car and so on. So he spends 4 of those 16 waking hours on the road or gathering the resources for it. So the model American puts in 1,600 hours a year to get 7,500 miles. And you can see where this is going. If you do the math, that's less than 5 miles per hour. No wonder so many American drivers don't look happy. A lot of people, when you explain this to them, they start to feel very uncomfortable, especially if they've just bought a new car and they realise it's not the fastest new car. So they come up with all these arguments, all this cognitive dissonance develops, and they think of all these arguments why, oh no, look, effective speed, that's not a valid concept, or it might be valid, but it doesn't apply to me. So let's have a look at some of the standard arguments against effective speed. The first one is, I've got no choice. I've got to use the car. There's no choice. There's no alternative. And depending on the choices of where you live and where you work, there may be no choice. There may be no public transit, or there may be, maybe too far to cycle. But it doesn't change the fact that your effective speed in the car might be very low. You can appreciate the irony in this one. I've got to have the second car to drive my child to school because of the traffic dangers created by parents driving the children to school. But apart from the irony, if instead of having the second car to drive to school, you didn't have that second car, you wouldn't need as much of an income. So assuming there were 2 parents, one of them could work part-time and they'd have time to walk with the children to school or cycle with them to school. Some people think the car gives us convenience, and on an individual level, in a city like Auckland or Dunedin, it probably does give you convenience. But the collective impact of everyone using the car is that the city spreads and local shops and schools and services close, so that things that used to be within walking and cycling distance are now not. So you've got the inconvenience now of having to have a car. Some people can understand the concept and they say, well, it makes sense to me, but I work 9 to 5, so even if I didn't have a car, I couldn't work any less. Maybe that's true, but you could retire earlier, perhaps 15 or 20 years earlier, depending on what sort of a car you didn't own. This is a quote that comes from a senior administrator from an Australian university. He used to drive a Holden Monaro, sort of a big V8 sports car. He was asked, why do you drive a Holden Monaro? And his answer was, well, it makes me feel younger. Had he sold the Monaro and done a bit more walking and cycling, he would have not only felt younger, but been a lot happier with his body image as well. A lot of young males believe that if they have a fancy car, they can help attract young ladies. And I saw a car in Canberra, a car that looked something like that, a Mitsubishi Lancer, which had this number plate, Forward Chicks, had a couple of young males in it. Now, I did put this to some young people in Vancouver, and one young lady, she was given the choice, do I go out with a young man in a hot car, or do I go out on the SkyTrain but go out to a restaurant and get flowers and chocolates? And she said, well, I'd take the chocolates because it's not my car. So maybe that strategy is not working for these young men. You probably know people who say, you know, I'm a skillful driver, so I drive faster than everyone else. You've probably got a term to describe them as well, like I have. The term I have starts with W, and the word is wrong. And they're wrong because the faster you drive, the less time you have. You might save a few seconds on the trip, but to earn the money to pay for the extra fuel, the extra wear and tear on yourself, the extra speeding fines, and the stress on everyone in society is going to cost a lot more than a few seconds. Some economists and traffic engineers look at effective speed and say, well, we don't need it. We've got cost-benefit analysis. Well, cost-benefit analysis hasn't got a proud legacy. And that's what you get when you use cost-benefit analysis. You get freeways with lots of traffic going nowhere. One of the problems with cost-benefit analysis is that it ignores the time spent winding up the spring. It just assumes that everyone has a car, and that's outside the equation. But that's a critically important part of the time we devote to our cars. So how can we calculate effective speeds? Well, three things we need: the total cost of running a car, the total time devoted to the car, and the total distance. If we look at the total cost, there's two ways of looking at this. The direct cost, that's the cost that you and I would pay if we owned a car. And then there's the indirect or the hidden or external cost that you and I don't pay, but the whole community, both in present and future generations, pays. We'll start off by looking at the direct costs, and then we'll move to the hidden or external costs. The cost of cars, if you go to motoring organisations like the AA in Australia or the NRMA, the National Roads and Motorist Association in New South Wales, then you can find out what the car operating costs are for different models, the fuel, depreciation, registration and so on. However, that's not the total cost. They don't include things like car parking or tolls or infringement fines. And in some cities, especially places like London or New York or even Sydney, car parking and tolls are a significant component of what the motorist has to pay to operate a car. Then there's the time devoted to the car. The main time component is the work time. So for an average driver with an average car, that's the main time component. There's a whole lot of other time components as well. Some people wash and vacuum and polish their car. Can't really understand why, but some people do that. And right down the bottom, we've got hours in the vehicle during each trip. But for most drivers, that's a fairly minor component of the total time devoted to the car. So let's have a look at some estimates of effective speed for car drivers, and we're going to look at data for single occupant car driving, or DODOs, as Frank Fisher from Melbourne calls them. And I think DODO is a really nice name for a car, something that's about to become extinct. DODO meaning driver only, driver owned. So we're looking at single occupant car driving, median, so average incomes, and we're going to start by looking at the direct costs. We'll start with the fastest new car, the Suzuki Alto, and in Melbourne and Sydney, it will give you an effective speed of about 15.8 or 14.9 kilometres per hour. But what if we were to take a car like a Holden Commodore? The Holden Commodore is a very popular car in Australia. In the last 10 years, more Holden Commodores have been sold than any other car. For 9 out of the last 10 years, it was Australia's top-selling car. So if you've got Australia's top-selling car, in Melbourne, you'd have an effective speed of 12.4 kilometres an hour. In Sydney, 11.9. So you can start to get the sense that maybe the car isn't giving you the speed that you think it does. Let's have a look at some international comparisons now. So we'll throw a Canadian city in there, Toronto, so that's about the same as Melbourne or Sydney. If you go to Tokyo, the speed starts to get a bit lower. New York, lower still. London, even lower. Delhi, approaching walking speed. And Nairobi, well, you could probably crawl faster than a car in Nairobi. So you can see, if you look at those international comparisons, even in cars, even in cities where cars are the dominant mode of transport and where people are really wealthy, places like Melbourne, Toronto, Sydney, then you still don't get very high effective speeds, and in some of the other cities, the speeds are very, very low. But there's more. We can also look at what we call social effective speed, which examines those external costs that Henk described really well in terms of what cost transport imposes on the rest of the community. So there's economic, environmental and social costs. And with Ian Kerr, I've estimated some of these in a paper called A Wish Call Squander. And there was a game called Squander. It was like Monopoly, but the object was to lose money, not to gain money. Very hard to calculate or estimate external costs. Like, how do you put a value on greenhouse gas? Is it $10 a tonne, $40 a tonne, $5 million a tonne? You know, what's it worth? So, but we can make some guesses at these. And if we take into account all those external costs, then this table here, the middle column, is the direct cost, the effective speeds with just looking at direct cost. The right column is the effective speed when you've taken into account some estimates of the external costs. When you look at that, in London and Delhi, you could probably walk faster than a car driver, and in Nairobi, well, the average 2-year-old could probably walk faster than a car driver. Now, the real interesting part of effective speed is what happens if we try to increase the trip speed. If you increase the speed at which we travel within the city, would that help? So let's assume that we could do that without that costing us anymore. Now, we can't do that, but let's assume that we could do that. Would it make any difference? Now, this is a really critical component because it shows how futile it is to try and increase trip speeds. It's just a complete waste of time. So we'll start off with looking at the Holden Commodore, the Suzuki Alto and a cyclist, and theoretically we'll increase the trip speed of each of them by 10 kilometres an hour without that costing us anything. The Holden Commodore, use Sydney data. If we increase the trip speed by 10 kilometres an hour, what do you think that would do to the effective speed? Would we get a good return? Would it be close to 10 kilometres an hour? Would it be close to 0? Okay, 1.4. Now, the reason for that is that with people who drive Commodores, the bulk of the time is the time they spend earning the money. So they don't spend much time driving it compared to the time they spend driving the money. So if you don't decrease the time spent earning the money, then the effective speed won't go down. You do slightly better with the Suzuki Alto. You'll get a return on your effective speed of 2.5 kilometres per hour. But what if we go to London and we use something like the Suzuki Alto there? What do you think? It's going to be pretty low, pretty high? 0.5. So if we could get all the cars in London to travel 10 kilometres an hour faster as they drive around London, that would give us a return on the effective speed of 0.5 kilometres an hour. And that's because in London, people spend an enormous amount on their cars, on their fuel, on tolls and on parking. What about the cyclist? Now, this is theoretical, but if we could get Cadell Evans as our personal trainer, and for those of you who haven't heard of Cadell Evans, he was the last winner of the Tour de France. So if we could get him as our personal trainer, or if we could get some of the drugs that the other cyclists use to win the Tour de France, and we could increase our trip speed by 10 kilometres an hour, that would give us a return in effective speed of 7.8 kilometres an hour, a much better return. So if you want to spend your money on increasing speeds, and I'm not saying we should, but if you do want to do that, you're much better off putting it into cycling and walking. You don't get a complete return because cyclists do have to spend some money, some time earning the money to pay for their bicycle. Now, those figures ignore the enormous amount of money it would cost to increase trip speeds. Now, if we took London for an example, and we tried to increase trip speeds in London by 10 kilometres an hour, we could do that. You'd have to build a lot of roads. You'd have to demolish Westminster Abbey and Buckingham Palace. You'd have to put a freeway through Hyde Park. You could do it, but there would be cost involved. There'd be pollution costs, accident costs. There'd also be health costs because pedestrians understand the laws of physics, and they understand if they get hit by a car that's going 10 kilometres an hour faster, they're more likely to die. So they're less likely to walk, and that creates a whole lot of health costs. Now, this is a question that was posed by Professor John Puka from Rutgers University. He asked me, how slow can you go on a bicycle and still be effectively faster than a car? So I did some estimates for cities around the world, and there you go. In Melbourne, Toronto and Sydney, you'd have to be a reasonably fit cyclist to be effectively faster than a car. In Tokyo and New York and London, well, you could ride along slowly eating your hot dog and still be effectively faster than a car. In Nairobi, you'd have trouble. You'd probably fall off your bicycle because, riding a bicycle at 2 kilometres an hour is very, very difficult. So there you go. That's how fast you need to go on a bicycle to be effectively faster than a car in different cities throughout the world. So speed not only consumes our time and our money, it also consumes our space. This is from John Puka's work as well. It's photos taken in Münster in Germany, and it shows the amount of space that you need to park the cars or the passengers or bicycles for 60 people. But that's not the end of the story. Cars do need a lot of space for parking, but they need an enormous amount of space when they're moving, and the faster they move, the more space they require. Now, let's assume we're going to park pedestrians. You could probably park about 20 pedestrians in the space that you'd park a car in. Of course, some cars need a little bit more space than others. But when you're moving, say at 100 kilometres an hour, the car requires more than 500 times as much space as a pedestrian. Because you need, well, I understand in American roads you don't actually leave gaps between the cars in front of you, but in Australia and New Zealand we do. But even at 50 kilometres an hour, assuming you leave a safe gap, a car's going to take up more than 200 times as much space as a pedestrian. Now, can active transport modes really save you time? This is a photo taken in Vancouver, and the man in the colourful clothing there, going past the Mercedes with the man with the dinner suit on, is thinking, well, yes, of course it can. In congested traffic, the trip speed's faster than a car. But this is forgetting about effective speed. But if you go to cities where active modes of transport are the dominant modes of transport, people spend less time on travel than they do in cities where the car is dominant. And let's have a look at some figures on that. If we compare Western European cities, where active modes of transport are more dominant, and North American cities, where the car is more dominant, in the North American cities, everyone travels a lot faster, but that doesn't save them time, because they actually spend more time travelling. So in the Western European cities, they only spend 43 minutes, their travel time budget per day travelling. In the North American cities, they spend 55 minutes. Just have a look at this again. So the Western European cities, they don't travel as fast, but they only spend 43 minutes per day travelling. The North American cities, they travel a lot faster, but they spend 55 minutes travelling. So all that increased speed doesn't save us time, it just allows us to cover more distance. And as you increase speed, the city expands, local shops and schools and services close, and so you've got to travel faster to make up for those extra distances, but you can never travel fast enough to make up for the extra distance. So low-density, car-dominated cities are paying for their dispersion with longer travel times. And remember, that wasn't even taking into account the effective speed, so it's actually much worse than that. The car consumes more time and distance than it saves, and it's futile to try and increase the speed of cars to save time. Now, youth perspectives on effective speed. I'm going to talk now about research that I did in British Columbia, in schools in Vancouver and Surrey, and at the University of British Columbia with undergraduate geography students. And I could not have done this research without the help of Arthur Orsini, whose local context managed to get me through the myriad of obstacles, getting permission from the school boards, getting into the schools and getting past the industrial action for the local teachers. So it was a pleasure to work with Arthur, looking at the views of young people. What I'm going to do is look at their views on a whole range of things. First of all, did they understand the concept of effective speed and what were their reactions to the effective speed concept? So these are some quotes from the focus groups. One young lady said, well, it definitely resonated with me. She had access to a car and to a bike and to public transit. So she said she made that decision every day. And you can imagine this young lady on the bicycle going past Burrard Sky Station thinking, would I have had a higher effective speed on the SkyTrain today? And depending on how fast she cycled, the SkyTrain could well have been faster. This is one from the University of British Columbia, and I think it's a brilliant comment. You have to introduce the irony in the concept that it's not about speed, it's more about efficiency with cost. This man on the bicycle here, it's the perfect example of efficiency with low cost. He's riding an Apollo bicycle. Now, I have an Apollo bicycle at home. I bought it in 1980. It was quite expensive then, but it's not worth much now. So he wouldn't have paid much for this bicycle. He hasn't paid anything for fancy cycling clothes or shoes or a rack. Hasn't even spent money on a helmet. But he's likely to have a higher effective speed than all those cars around him. This person had rationalised the ideas. They bike or bus as much as they can. And so they said it seemed like something that I understood already, but they'd never actually thought about it before, so they appreciated the whole framework of effective speed. If you look at the picture there, the guy on the right is probably effectively faster than the guy on the left, simply because the guy on the left would have paid a fortune for that bike with those fancy red wheels. Someone else said, I wouldn't have thought of it that way. I didn't think that overall riding a bike would be more effective than driving a car. But it's intuitive and people can understand it if they understand how the costs need to be internalised. So you can imagine the guy on the bike here in the yellow t-shirt thinking, yep, I can internalise the cost, I understand this concept, I'm faster than that car that's about to pass me. A bit like this young lady here. This was interesting. Someone was saying, look, if you get used to riding a bicycle, it makes a lot of sense and you become attached to it. And I think the reason you become attached to it is because of all that information you said about effective speed, whether you acknowledge it or not. So it's, again, sort of some intuitive understanding of the effective speed concept. If you were to think about it a bit, then it's easy to come to those conclusions. And this young lady here on the bicycle, she's just been overtaken by a car, but she's thinking to herself, I've just read this article on the speed paradox and I know I'm faster than that car. Long-term benefits and short-term pressures. Can young people think long-term? Well, a bit of disagreement here in the focus groups. Some young people think, no, you don't think in the long term. The caption there at the bottom, life's pretty good in the fast lane. So they just live in the moment, they just want to go fast. And going fast is pretty exciting for young people. So that was one view, but other young people had different views. This young lady from Templeton High School, she said, well, yes, it's easy to think long term because I'm always thinking about my future and what I want to do after school. I'm not really surprised about this concept because driving cars is like short-term beneficial, but in the long term, you know it's going to be more expensive. And, getting back to Hank's point, there's more risk that you're going to get injured. And people don't think about this because everyone drives a car and it's kind of socially accepted. Very deep comment from that young lady from Templeton High School in Vancouver. What about the impact of transport choice? Now, as Hank pointed out, if people have good transport choices for walking, cycling, public transport, they'll use them. One student said, well, I'm going to uni next year and I can get this uni pass for $100 a year. It gives me transport over the lower mainland, so most of Vancouver, for the whole year. So, why would they buy a car? You've got good public transit, reasonably good efficiency and frequency of public transit. They're going to use it. However, this person was thinking about going to Auckland. And she'd been to Auckland before, and she realised, to quote Hank's term, that reality sucks in Auckland. And that if you try and catch a bus and you miss it, you've got to wait an hour for the next one. Now, I did a bit of research and I found this picture of someone waiting for a bus in Auckland. And I discovered that it was Ali Williams, or Comical Ali, an All Black. And I was really pleased to see that, we have an All Black, a big rugby player, waiting for a bus. Now, he's been waiting for that bus for 4 months. And there he is, he's waiting for another bus. But it's good to see the All Blacks trying to use public transport. It's not just public transport, though. If you have a city where facilities for cycling aren't available, then young people are much less likely to use it. One of the great things about Vancouver is that they've invested in a lot of these fantastic cycle routes, and they're used in very high numbers by cyclists. A culture of speed. Now, this next quote is just gold in terms of a culture of speed. It's a person who says, yeah, I understand the effective speed concept, but I just love speed. So I'll let you have a read through that one and see what you think. So he understands the concept, but he's just got to drive fast. Okay? If people are driving under the speed limit, it's so annoying, he's got to get around them. It's not road rage, but, I've just got to get around them. And when I was typing this up, I thought, it reminded me of some people that I've spoken to in Australia who listen to talkback radio a lot and say, I'm not racist, but... So, it's not road rage, but... So, I can understand the concept, but, bugger it, I'm going to try and drive fast anyway. So that was one view, this locked into this culture of speed, but not everyone had this culture of speed. Other people thought that racing around isn't going to get them anywhere. And one person explained it very well. She said it depends on where you're driving. If you're going to Whistler, which is about 2 hours drive north of Vancouver, and you haul ass, which I understand means drive quickly, you can probably get there faster. But if I do the same speed increase in Vancouver, then I'll probably only save 2 minutes, not much at all really. Now, I know people who spend more than 2 minutes every night looking for the television remote, so saving 2 minutes on a car trip's not really that big deal. And they also pointed out that it's going to be very stressful, they'll be living on the edge, and in the end, the time saving isn't worth it. So there's an awareness that driving fast doesn't save you time. Then, this is really nice too, a culture of slowness. This is a young lady who said, how about the idea of slowness in terms of what's going on inside? Particularly deep comment. I use the bus to read fiction. That's 2 hours a day for reading. It's super effective. I wouldn't have the time to read if I drove. When this comment came out in the focus groups, all the other people in the focus groups nodding heads, yeah, that's right, yeah, you go on the bus, you go on the train, you've got all this time for reading. So here we are, this is the Sky Train, one of the Sky Trains in Vancouver, a couple of cyclists there reading the newspapers. The good thing about catching the bus or the train in Vancouver is if you forget to bring something along to read, you just sit next to someone who has something to read. So slowing down, you change your mode from driving to public transport or even cycling, and it can change your mode of being. So could effective speed, the concept of effective speed, support behaviour change, travel behaviour change? Well, mixed views on this. Some people thought that most young people wouldn't care about it because you'd explain it to them, they'd say, well, it doesn't matter to us, we're not paying for the car. So if you're using Dad's car, or if Dad's buying a car for you, or Dad and Mum, then the effective speed argument doesn't apply. So if we want to get young people to understand the cost of cars, we need to encourage parents to explain to them in great detail the costs, and not just the direct costs, but those external costs as well. This is a nice one, came from a student at the University of British Columbia, a geography student, where they learned about ecological footprints. Has anyone heard about ecological footprints? Ecological footprint is the area of land, the number of hectares or acres of land that you'd need to support a certain lifestyle, to support the food that you'd need, the resources that you use, and the forest that you'd need to sequester the carbon dioxide. It's one unit, a unit of area. So it's a bit like effective speed, a single number. If you wanted to reduce your ecological footprint and you got rid of your car, you could reduce it by 20%. Now this person went on to say, a way to get this effective speed to work would be to have this website where people type in all their details and they can calculate what their effective speed is for different transport options. So I've had a bit of a play with that, and we'll have a look at this and have a bit of fun with it. This is a pretty crude version. I need to tidy it up a bit, but let's have a look at what would happen by 2020. And young people are thinking about what will happen by 2020, and they're very aware of the fact that peak oil could start to bite, and that we might not have cars or have the ability to use cars in the form that we think we would. So let's have a look at effective speeds in future cities and make a few assumptions. And we'll start with a base of a small car in 2011. We'll use this effective speed calculator and we'll put in some have a guess at what might happen. So the cost of the car is $13,000. What would the effective car be in 2020, the effective speed of a car be for a small car in 2020? 13,000, well the cost of the car is going to double to 26,000, okay? Supposedly because oil is more expensive, parts are more expensive, everything's more expensive. And that will reduce the effective speed. The depreciation will increase as well because cars are becoming an increasingly unworkable mode of transport. They're becoming increasingly worthless. The fuel economy will increase and that will increase the effective speed. But the cost of the fuel will jump from $1 a litre to $5 a litre, and that will decrease the effective speed. The insurance will increase because there'll be fewer cars on the road, and all those people who used to drive cars will be so jealous of the people that still drive cars that when you pull up at a set of traffic lights, you'll probably have your wheels stolen. So the insurance is going to go up. The registration is going to go up because fewer cars, the governments will need to charge more for the remaining cars to cover the cost. The servicing and repairs will go up because parts and materials are going to be more expensive. The infringement fines will stay the same because people will be really careful. But the car parking will go up dramatically. You can see what's happening with the effective speed. It's going down, down, down. The tolls, governments will have to put in tolls to try and cover the cost of the road. There will have been by 2020, this is tongue-in-cheek, we don't really know what's going to happen, but by 2020 there could have been a global economic meltdown that made the 2008 GFC look like a walk in the park. So the average incomes are going to halve down to 20,000. And finally the trip speed. The trip speed is going to reduce dramatically, not because of congestion on the road, because there'll be fewer cars, but because governments won't be able to afford to maintain the roads to a reasonable level of service, and there'll be all these extra potholes providing this default traffic calming. So we're now down to 5.5 kilometres per hour. We haven't looked at the external costs. That's a tongue-in-cheek look of how this effective speed estimator might work. Would an awareness of effective speed make a difference to the type of car they bought? Well, again, a very sensible answer. It would depend on the sort of person you're talking to. If they're a car enthusiast, then they just want to have the fancy car no matter what it costs. But if they're out to save money, then they can understand that one with a higher effective speed would be a good investment. This is one that I think was closer to the mark, or closer to what I think has shows the potential of effective speed. It seems like the effective speed calculation is good for policy and planning. So if we can get our politicians, our planners, our traffic engineers, our economists to understand this, then they'll start making some sensible decisions about how to invest in transport. They won't be putting their efforts into futile efforts to increase the speed of cars. If they want to increase the speed of anything, they'll be trying to increase the speed of pedestrians and cyclists. Now, I think the key insight for me that comes out of this is that we've got to change the mindset. We've got to go for that deep cultural change that Henk was talking about. We've got to get out of the mindset of rushing and trying to be productive and trying to save time. What we need to do is to think about living in the present, the power of now, as one famous book puts it. And I think if we can do that and we can move people to active transport, we'll get some synergies. If we move people to active modes of transport, they'll have more time because they have higher effective speeds than cars. They'll also help to move people to a different mindset, a different way of looking at the way they spend their time. So seeing time on the bus as time for reading rather than tense and having to get there and being forced into road rage. So if we want to improve the health of urban residents, what we should be doing is investing in the fastest modes of transport. And you now know that the fastest modes of transport in any city in the world are the active modes, particularly cycling. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. Are there any questions for Paul at this point? Go ahead.
Paul, I really appreciate the deep cultural change dimension of what you're talking about, and I'm wondering about mechanisms for affecting it. On the surface, we'd all, I think, like to be moving a little more slowly, or at least at our own pace. But the problem that keeps recurring to me is that effective time, though it's a very valuable measure, doesn't get you to the meeting on time. And when society is predicated on these very sharp, defined, by-the-clock ways of organizing our days, making an argument for effective time may run into some problems about quote-unquote real-world realism.
Yeah, that's true. And if I just give a personal story, several years ago my boss died, our head of school, and I had to take over as head of school very suddenly. So I went home and I said to my wife, look, I've got this new position at work, it's a lot of responsibility, I'll have to work late, we're going to have to buy the second car again. She said, okay, so we went out and had a look for a second car. We found a nice car, with the high effective speed, although I wasn't thinking like that at the time. I was about to sign on the dotted line and I thought, the speed paradox. What am I doing? This is crazy. So I didn't buy the car, and I decided that instead of cycling to work, I'd catch the bus because I could work on the bus. And the other advantage was the last bus left at 6:15 p.m. So if I was in a meeting, I could just stand up and say, sorry, got to go, last bus. So it was a personal decision on my part to have a slower pace of life. I could drive to work in 20 minutes, catch the bus in an hour. Catch the bus in an hour, I get about 40 minutes of effective work done, so I haven't actually lost any time. And I'm also more relaxed when I get there. So if you can get people to think through the way that a switch to active modes of transport can make them more relaxed and also give them that freedom to say, look, sorry, I'm not going to buy into this pressure to work till 7 p.m. at night. I ought to go and catch the bus. So that's one way to do it. There's a bit of good news coming too, and that is that if there is a global economic meltdown, we won't have to worry so much about working hard because very few of us will have jobs. So a bit of positive spin there. Yes, up the back there.
Paul, I just wanted to, I quite enjoyed your talk, thanks very much. And I just wanted to question some of your costs. Mm-hmm. You talk about the cost of cars, near the end you talk about the cost of cars going up. But in real terms, the cost of cars are coming down relative to wages. You talked about servicing costs. In real terms, servicing costs are coming down. Mm-hmm. My parents, it took about 5 years of their wages to buy a car. Mm-hmm. Today.
That's true.
So there's powerful disincentives. And the other thing I wanted to ask you about is the fixed costs. Now you talk about a lot of your arguments in an urban context. Mm-hmm. So, okay, you can ride the bike, but then people want to go and see their grandmother in a distant city or whatever they want to do in their recreation. So they buy a car for that. Mm-hmm. So there's fixed costs. Mm. And that car's depreciating whether you drive it once a week or 200 times a week. And so I'd like you to, there's some balance here, isn't there? There's some optimal return.
That's right. Once you've got the car, once you've paid those fixed costs, the tendency is to use it to get your money out of it. So just go back to your first point. Yeah, cars are cheap, and they're the servicing costs and the purchase costs. The fuel's going up, but the operating cost is.
Will be less.
Sorry?
Because if the cars are cheaper, mm-hmm. the effective cost is actually cheaper.
The effective cost is cheaper and the effective speed is higher. So the cheaper the car is, the higher the effective speed. My prediction about the future, and that's it's always a bit risky predicting the future, but I don't think that's going to last because oil prices are likely to increase. We have reached the end of cheap oil. The peak of oil production in terms of conventional oil was 2005, so we're now getting into the oil that's harder to get at and more expensive to get at with a poorer energy return on investment. So this assumption that we can keep on having cars and they'll be cheap depends on two things. One, a healthy economy where people are reasonably wealthy, and two, cheap energy, particularly cheap oil. We can't assume that either of those things are going to continue. So you're right that cars have probably never been as cheap as they are now. But perhaps the good news is that that's not going to continue indefinitely. Your other point, though, is an excellent one in terms of the way in which motorists are encouraged to use the car if they've got it. And one possible way around that would be to have per mile or per kilometre insurance or registration costs. So if you have a car and you don't drive it, you don't actually pay anything for the registration and insurance. But if you drive it a lot, then you pay more. Now, in Australia at the moment, there's this perverse tax incentive where you can actually get a better tax return if you drive it further than if you drive it a shorter distance. So it's a just bizarre thing. So we need to reverse those perverse incentives. And if we can move to pay as you drive, then you start to think about insurance and registration in much the same way as you think about petrol when you're putting in the car. So thank you. Good questions.
We have time for more questions.
Paul, I wondered if the young people you spoke with in Vancouver had a different approach to cars, like showed a generational change that might be similar to phone use. More and more young people flatting are not buying a landline. They all have a portable phone and sometimes even borrow each other's. Did they talk about cars in the same way? Oh, I wouldn't need to own one because I could go somewhere and pick up one on a rental basis, or not car rental, but there's these new companies that
the car shares.
share.
No,
I could pick up a car easily, I would clean it and return it, and similar to use a phone for a short while and not need to own one.
That's interesting, because everywhere you go in Vancouver, you see these cars that have things like car to go, the car share schemes, and they are quite popular. None of the young people that were in the focus groups mentioned the car share schemes. What they did mention, however, was borrowing a car from their brother or from their father. But that would be an ideal way of reducing the cost and getting people to move from the car. So people like myself, for example, we do have a car in our household. To convince my wife to give up the car would be difficult, but maybe to go to a car share scheme would be quite possible. But it didn't come out in the focus groups. I don't know whether that's because the young people that we talked with didn't think that way, or it just didn't come up. But it's something that I'll bring up in the next focus group. Thank you.
We have plenty of time. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I have two questions, but the first one is about the Vancouver study, which I haven't heard any results until now. So the two schools were in really different communities. One was very inner city central, and one was out in the outer suburbs. Is there anything you can talk about responses in that?
Yes, yeah. The one in the outer suburban area, it was in White Rock, very close to the United States border. So it was effectively part of the Vancouver urban area, but a very long way out. And the responses were different there, and it was a lot about there's no choice. Okay, if I want to go to a job in in Vancouver or into another outer suburban area, and I want to get there within a couple of hours, then there is no choice. Whereas in the inner city environments, where the public transport was much better, or where cycling was a realistic option, there was much more talk about those other options. So it's again a case of, as Hank was pointing out, if the services are there, then young people will use those. So did you have two questions there, Arthur? Or?
That was one.
Yeah.
I do have another one. So it sort of builds on that. When you showed the slides of European and North American use of time and distance, there's an aspect of Europeans are traveling less and they're also spending less time. So we can talk about land use on that. But I know from something that was influential in my life that there's ideas of choice. And I read this very succinct quote 20 years ago from a woman who was car-free, and she said, if we run out of apple juice at 5 p.m., we don't go get it, as opposed to go out and drive it. So what does choice come into how people's effective speeds take place? Do people who don't have cars just choose to travel less, and therefore it's even lower speeds?
It's a really good question, and I've often thought about that myself when my wife says to me, look, we've run out of zucchinis. And I say, okay, we've run out of zucchinis, just have a meal without zucchinis. And it's only a 1 kilometre walk down to our local shop, so it's no big deal. I think in terms of effective speed, it's about that changing the mindset. So it's about speed and productivity and having to sort of get sort of the maximum return at every time. With a car, you could go down to the shop and get what you need at any time. But if you don't think about the cost of that, then the zucchini is not going to be $2 a kilogram. It's going to be $20 a kilogram by the time you factor in all the other costs. So I guess it's about long-term versus short-term thinking again. And if you do think long-term, then it helps you to slow your life down, and everyone's better off. Oh.
One of the interesting intersections between your world in effective speed that I've come to appreciate and the world I've occupied a lot, which is road safety and injury prevention, is the idea that injury and death is also a loss of time. It's a risk of a loss of time. You want to amplify that a little bit? Because I think the audience that we have today will appreciate that.
Well, to give a Canberra example, in Canberra there's a lot of cycle paths or shared paths where pedestrians can use them as well. A lot of those are completely segregated from the roads and they're very pleasant to use, but they're also quite circuitous, so you're going around trees and lakes, so they take longer. There are on-road cycle tracks as well. Now, if you go on road, it's a lot quicker, but the trade-off is, do you go on the slow, windy one, and it might take an extra 20 minutes, or do you go on the faster one, but lose 40 years of your life? That's the trade-off. And I think a lot of people do make that decision. I make that decision. I'd prefer to live a bit longer, take a bit longer on the trip, really enjoy the trip, rather than go for speed and run the risk of getting run over. So, yeah, that long-term risk is a really important consideration, and I think in terms of the risk to drivers, to cyclists, to pedestrians, that's not really taken into account in enough detail in enough studies. That it's a huge time loss, and if it's you or a loved one that's losing that time, it's particularly important.
Well, it really seems that infrastructure plays an important role, non-motorized transportation infrastructure, multi-purpose bike paths, and so on. I think probably championing the cost arguments is a good way to go. If again we use the Ontario example, if we look at the cheapest construction project for 400 series 6-lane highways, 1 kilometre costs about $9 million, according to 2011 estimates. You can get between 180 and 300 kilometres of 3-metre wide packed gravel multi-purpose trail for that. And I just wondered if you were able to see any direct correlates between people's willingness to give up motorized transportation and the availability of local infrastructure, because it seems like a really good deal to be.
Yes, it does. There's several issues there. One, people don't think about those external costs, so they don't see themselves as having to pay for that, even that they do. The other thing is the relative advantage of one versus the other and whether people would use it. So if everyone's driving a car and they see the money spent on a bicycle infrastructure, they see that as a waste of money because they're not on a bicycle. So you've got to get people to move towards the active modes of transport at the same time that you're investing in it. And I agree, the efficiency in terms of cost of investment in those facilities is just dramatic. And the point I made also is that if you've already got a road system and you're trying to increase the speed, it's completely futile. It just, it will not save any time. So, but if you can increase the speed of cycling by using things like the green waves that they use in Copenhagen, where you cycle along and there's little lights, flashing green lights on bollards, and if you can keep up with the flashing green lights, which I understand is about 15 kilometres an hour, then you get all the traffic lights, so you just go straight through. So there are ways to improve the cycling speed, but I think at the moment in Australia, a lot of people see the money spent on cycling, they see that as a waste of money, simply because the bulk of people don't use it. So you've got to get the behaviour travel change and the infrastructure going at the same time.
We have time for one more question. Did I see a hand in the back?
Claire.
Claire.
In 2009, I lived in Brisbane, and I used a bike to go everywhere with my 8-year-old son, and we cycled right into the middle of the city and along the river, and it was great. It was no problem. Now, what I want you to talk about is what we need to do in Dunedin. If you look at Dunedin, there's a strong resistance to particularly cycling, not so much pedestrian, because if you cycle in Dunedin, you risk your life. I know this because I got knocked off my bike in South Dunedin in November, and what was very interesting about that was the newspaper said there had been 4 accidents in November in Dunedin, but mine wasn't counted because it wasn't reported, and every year we have at least one cyclist killed. I don't know what the statistics are, but people get killed on bikes in Dunedin. And also we have, I don't know how many people here can get up those hills in Dunedin.
Well,
I can't, but so there are some practical issues, particularly for cycling in Dunedin. Also, it's a small city, there's no parking problems, it's easy to get around, there's no traffic jams, by and large. If you wait twice for a traffic light to change in Dunedin, that's a traffic jam, you know. So cars are very, very easy to use here. And I know that you give a lot of talks to councils and authorities. Do you have any success? And if you had to talk to Dunedin City Council, who at the moment in their annual plan say they're going to increase cycle lanes by 2 kilometres a year. They've just put off trying to do the cycle lane around the harbour. They're probably going to put it off till 2015, 2016. There is strong resistance to encouraging more active modes of transport in this city. So when you talk to councils, how do you get them to not put off till 2016 doing the cycleways, to encourage and make it safer? Do you have any success in talking to city councils like Dunedin?
No. And I think, well, that's probably been a little bit unfair. I mean, I can get people to start to think about it in terms of effective speed, but also, you know, the child-friendly nature of it, and how, you know, driving children to school isn't a very sensible strategy, you know, holistically. And people can get that, but they're still locked into this, you know, speed and productivity mindset, and they don't really see putting money into cycling as something that will be politically acceptable at the time. So getting back to the point I mentioned about Dave, you know, we've got to both work on the infrastructure, work on the political decision making, and work on behaviour change all at the same time to try and get that to happen. I mean, 2 kilometres per year, that's very generous, isn't it? I sometimes despair at you know, where things are going, and other times I think, well, everything's going to be fine. There will come a stage sooner or later where it won't be just poor people who can't afford to drive, it'll be the majority of people who can't afford to drive. And I think when that time comes, we need to seize on those opportunities. But as Hank said, rather than waiting for that time to come and waiting for, you know, for the crisis to come, we should be starting to prepare for it already. So maybe another thing is to get people to think long term, and to think about what future societies are going to think of them when they realise that we have made ourselves very vulnerable by being so dependent on the motor car in a future where the motor car has very limited potential to provide mass transport for everyone, as it does in Vancouver at the moment.
Go ahead.
Just a quick comment, but I used to cycle with one of the traffic engineers in the DCC, and talking to him, his point was, don't try to get people on their bikes to go to work straight away, get them recreationally cycling. So what they should be doing is building more recreational tracks, get them cycling, and then you build up pressure for using, you know, bicycling to work. But if you just try to get people on the road straight away, you know, in terms of saying go to work on a bike, it's great. You'll get you'll have people getting knocked off the bikes. Yeah. So his argument was go the recreational route and then work on the other.
I think you might want to talk to Arthur, or Arthur might talk about that later, the importance of starting somewhere with a particular group, and the recreational cyclist is one. Dave?
But also to tie into that comment, I think it's really fallacious to think that we should be looking to road infrastructure to dictate where we put bicycles. I don't want my 6-year-old driving separated from Audis by a line of paint on the road. I want her well away from traffic flows.
The other issue there is the idea that if you're cycling along a road where the cars are going along at 60 or 80 kilometres an hour, that's incredibly dangerous. But if the cars are doing 30 kilometres an hour or less, that's much less dangerous. So I think I'd agree, and I'm one of those people that much prefers to be well away from the roads for 2 reasons. One, it's safe, and 2, it's more pleasant. But we also need to think about ways in which we can encourage the people who are going to cycle across the entire city. And if you go to places like Graz in Austria, where there's a blanket speed limit of 30 kilometres an hour across the entire city, except for the main roads where you can do 50, that's a much safer environment for cyclists and for children. So I'd agree. I think we need those off-road things for particularly young children. We also need to make the whole environment safer for pedestrians and cyclists, and reducing speed is the most effective way to do that. And it's got a whole lot of other benefits. But someone behind...
Yes, last question from the woman.
I was just curious, how do you try to convince like North Americans such as Canadians where we have drastic winters and you're trying to convince us to cycle? Like, we can't cycle all season long, so we have to buy that second vehicle. Like, how are you going to convince us to bike more?
Yeah, I did spend a few months in Vancouver, which doesn't get cold, I understand, by Canadian standards, and I did leave at the end of November, so I've never really experienced that. That's a serious issue. If you think about how to get around that, that's where transit, as you call it, could come into the fore. And places like Toronto have a transit system that enables people to get around for most parts of Toronto, apart from Mississauga, which is an absolute misery saga, as they call it. In environments where you can't walk and cycle, then we need to have a public transport system that makes it viable for people to have a mode other than the car to choose. Or you just, get tough and put lots of clothes on. I mean, people used to do that, and people who live in Fairbanks in Alaska, they've got to get to their cars. So, when it's minus 70 degrees, they seem to manage. So good luck with that one.
Thank you, Paul, for a wonderful keynote. That was wonderful. Thank you.